All right, let's get this presenting. I'm just going to use the PowerPoint that was in the Nearpod, but the advantage is now you have me with it. So, 5 scientists that contributed to the cell theory. The first was Anton von Leeuwenhoek in the 1600s, and his contribution is that he was the first to design a microscope. And so that's opened up a whole world for us, because microscope literally means, scope means to look, and micro, of course, means tiny. So it allows us to look at tiny things that we can't see with our eyes. And so that has literally opened up a whole world of bacteria and other single cells to us. His microscope was very simple. It had a place for the sample, what we now call the stage. It had a very simple lens, which was kind of a glorified magnifying glass. He did have an ability to focus, but it was not a huge range of focus there, but it did allow him to focus some. And it just allowed him to see things. And he would look at things like a droplet of water, and this is just from a pond, so you might see these things. He might have seen these things. Algae and this Daphnia, which is a little animal. And so his contribution was just that he allowed us to see cells. His microscope, of course, led to more technological microscopes over time that gave us even greater ability to see cells. Fast forwarding a little bit, one thing I wanted to point out with Leeuwenhoek too, notice the year. He was born in 1630, so this was in, probably getting close to 1700. There was no electricity, so there is no light source here because there was no electricity. So he was using sunlight or candlelight to illuminate his specimens. All right, fast forwarding a little bit. Robert Hooke studied cork. Cork is just dead plant cells, and this is a picture of cork. And so the cell walls are still there, because cell walls don't degrade very easily, but all of the stuff inside, the cytoplasm, the nucleus, all that is degraded, it's gone. And he was familiar with monasteries, and monasteries are broken up into rooms that we call cells. That we now, of course, you only use that term really with prisons. When you think of a prison cell, that's the room in a prison. But that's also what monastery rooms were called. And so when he saw this, he said, you know what, these look like the rooms in a monastery. I'm going to call them cells. So his contribution was to coin that term. Fast forward now about 200 years to the 1800s, we have Matthias Schleiden, and he was a German botanist who was a botanist, of course, means this one who studies plants. And he kind of brought all this together and said, hey, we've got these microscopes, we can look at cells. Hey, I love plants, let's look at plant cells. And as he studied all of the plants that he had access to, he realized that all of them were made of cells. Around that same time, Theodor Schwann, who was a zoologist, he studied animals, and he said the same thing. Say, hey, Schleiden, good job. Yeah, plants are made of cells, but guess what? So are animals. And so they started to realize that every living thing was made of cells. And then fast forward another 20 or so years, and we have Rudolf Virchow. There's a good old Rudy boy. He was a doctor, studied diseases, so a pathologist, and he wanted to know where diseases came from, because if I'm going to study diseases and I want to get rid of diseases, I need to know where they come from. And so he started looking at how cells reproduced, and he realized that cells came from pre-existing cells. Before this, there was this concept of what we call spontaneous generation, which we now know is false. And so if somebody had some meat and they came back a couple days later and it had rotted and there were maggots growing on it, they thought that the maggots just came from nowhere. They just spontaneously arrived, just arose out of nothing. And that is, Virchow said, no, that's not actually what's happening. There were little, somebody laid eggs in that meat, and that is what they hatched and became the maggots or whatever. So he was the first to kind of say spontaneous generation is not a thing. Every cell comes from another cell that already existed. And of course, he cared a lot about this because he studied diseases, and he wanted to know where those diseases came from, because then he could hopefully prevent them. So all of these were combined into the cell theory. And the cell theory says that all living organisms are made of cells. The cell is the basic unit of structure and function for all living organisms, and all presently existing cells came from previously existing cells. So what do those statements mean? Well, the first is that everything that's alive, and that's anything that's in any of the 6 kingdoms. So there are 2 bacteria kingdoms. There are 4 that are eukaryotes, protists, fungi, plants, and animals. Anything in any of those 6 kingdoms is alive. And so I've got a couple different of those kingdoms down here. Didn't put any bacteria because you saw some of those slides a minute ago with Virchow. The second was cells are the basic unit of structure and function. And this basically just means that there is nothing smaller than a cell that can do all of the characteristics of life. So if you think about those 8 characteristics of life, can grow, develop, reproduce, maintain homeostasis, respond to the environment, obtain energy, all of those things that living organisms can do, the cell can do. And so, but nothing smaller than the cell. So the cell is that basic unit of life. There are two types of organisms. There are unicellular, those that are made of a single cell, and they literally can do all 8 characteristics of life in that single cell. For those of us that are multicellular, each cell can do that, so all cells can reproduce. They go through mitosis or meiosis. All cells can obtain energy, but their jobs, their main jobs, are broken up. They're delegated. So we have jobs, we have cells that make insulin, and we have cells that contract to your muscle cells. But those basic 8 characteristics of life, all cells can do, even in a multicellular organism. And the third statement is that all presently existing cells came from previously existing cells, and that just means that spontaneous generation is not true. That in order for a cell to be there, it had to come from a cell prior to that. And so this is meiosis. This is showing us bacteria going through binary fission. And I think this is showing the different like cytoskeletal things that are involved in mitosis. And so this would be sexual reproduction, and these are asexual reproduction. One exception to the rule, and we don't have a lot of exceptions in biology, but one is viruses. And they kind of are a gray area because they do not do all the characteristics of life on their own. So a virus, if you just have a virus sitting on a desk, like the top of a desk, it can't grow and develop. It can't divide. It can't reproduce. It can't obtain energy. But when it's inside of the host, it can do all of those things. And so it's kind of like it's not alive when it's outside of the host, but it acts like it is alive when it's inside the host. And so that's a big debate. And some scientists say, yep, viruses are living. Others say, no, they're not. And then others say they're kind of on the fence. I don't know. They're an exception to the cell theory because they're not cells, but they can do these characteristics of life. So again, that's still a debate. I don't know if it'll ever be resolved because there'll be people on both sides. But anyway, that should hopefully help you as far as who contributed what to the cell theory and explaining the cell theory. So I hope that helped. And if not, let me know what other questions you have.